this edition of World Crisis Radio. This is your host, Webster Tarpley, PhD, speaking from the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. We've just had a brush with a tornado. There was a tornado warning issued, a warning with detailed maps where it was going to go. And that started off in Fairfax County in Northern Virginia, went across the Potomac, through the Maryland suburbs, and then off in the general direction of Baltimore. It'll probably break up. But in the meantime, what are we left with? No serious damage here, right? This was one of these events where the Weather Service can judge from radar the potential for rotation and perhaps even a couple of small initial signs of rotation. But in this case, no funnel cloud emerged, and also they were expecting 70-mile-an-hour gusts. Now, you know, of course, what these things always signify here, and that is, you know, you look at the Julius Caesar by Shakespeare or King Lear on the Heath. The great classical dramas see the weather as one of the most effective metaphors for the state of human affairs. And when you think about King Lear on the Heath, raving and cursing the elements, because he toppled all the hierarchies, right? King Lear turned the world upside down. He punished his friends, especially his daughter Cornelia. He treated her horribly. And, of course, he gave all power to his two evil, grasping, greedy, ambitious daughters and their somewhat ineffective husbands. So, dear listeners, what can we compare this to? Why? To the condition of the United States government at this juncture, where we have a so-called would-be chief executive who is for all the world like King Lear out on the Heath. And our situation is very serious. We have powerful enemies. We're living in that three-cornered world. It is a tripartite world. It is an Orwellian world. It is Russia, China, and a couple of satellites of China. And then the camp around the U.S. would be the United States, Canada, Mexico, plus Europe, plus Japan, plus Australia, New Zealand, and a number of other places around the world, right? And this is a different kind of civilization. And few are those who would actually choose to live under the oriental despotism of the Emperor Xi and his totalitarian social credit program. And few are also the ones who might want to transfer themselves to the Neo-Byzantine, oligarchically ruled plutocracy of Putin, where you have no rights. Now here you supposedly have some rights. Of course, these are often honored more in the breach than in the observance, but you still have a fairly powerful legal claim on paper to some rights, and that might make all the difference. You've also got a traditional belief in the population that you should be free. Maybe you're not free, but soon you will be. So there is that element of optimism. So that's where we are. Now let's get right to the heart of the matter. We want to start with objective criteria. That is to say, we'll do some public opinion polls later, And they're important, right? When you show Biden leading Trump by 8 percentage points, that's a significant lead. I think you're going to see Trump in a more and more shocking display of bombastic rhetoric, gesticulation, raving, what they call red meat. We call it raving. Red meat for the base. Man, they are really base. Those guys, base-born, base-bred, lived in a base life, and therefore they qualify as the base. So that's them. Trump went to see them today. It's, of course, Friday, the 26th of April. Trump went to see them at the NRA, the National Rifle Association Convention. And, of course, this is an organization which is now in the odor of subversion. In other words, it's a subversive organization. It's really, in many ways, prefers foreign dictators to the U.S. System and the U.S. government. So that is, of course, a terrible historical mistake. But my main point now is here, we got to get out the pocket constitution, right? I have mine from the bicentennial. That was 1987. Oh, my God, 30 years have already gone by. So this is a pocket constitution put out by them and distributed. The one I have for some reason is the Michigan Commission on the Bicentennial in Lansing. Anyway, that's what I have. And in here you get the text of the Constitution, right? This document of remarkable economy. And remember where it comes from. These are the insights put together by Niccolò Machiavelli, based on the Roman historian, a Greek, wrote in Greek, that is to say, his precursor was a Greek historian in the late Greek language historian in the late Roman Empire, and it was observations on how Rome had thrived and then had gotten into severe trouble. And one of the things was the role of the tribune of the people. That is to say, a system, primitive system, but effective, of checks and balances, at least for a while. And then Machiavelli developed that. It was then picked up by John Adams. John Adams, really the father of all U.S. constitutions, because he wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, which turned out to be the model for most of them, certainly for the federal Constitution. Adams was overseas on diplomatic work during the Constitutional Convention, so the attempt of the Brand X historians is to say, oh yeah, this is all the benefit of Madison and these people, right, slaveholders. Adams was not a slaveholder, and he had embodied this thing about the three branches, the checks and balances. He wrote in a marvelous clause on the imperative of education. None of this works unless you've got rising levels of education among the people. Anyway, that's where we get it. Adams published hundreds of pages of translations from Machiavelli. Largely he got them elsewhere, but he had to edit them and so forth, and he did. So that's where this comes from. All right. So the thing that we always want to look at is the preamble. Why? The preamble tells you what the purpose of this government is. In other words, what is it there to do? Conquer the world? Carry out genocide? Pass out the Kool-Aid? No. We'll tell you in a minute, but it does call. This is Webster Tarpley, Ph.D., speaking to you from the nation's capital, buffeted by tornado warnings in the past couple of hours here. And this, of course, a very important metaphor for the crisis of the regime that we're now in, and which it's in everybody's interest to bring to a close. Let me point to actually one of my least favorite people based on long experience going back decades. William Weld, the former federal prosecutor and former governor of Massachusetts, now providing an important public service by running against Trump for the Republican nomination. Weld has called on Trump to resign, and that is heartily to be approved. And if you're a Republican, it's time to search your conscience, I would say, and remember what the Pope said, right? If you're building walls rather than bridges, you're not a Christian, and that goes for Trump and his coterie of paid divine. All right, so we were saying, the Constitution of the United States has this wonderful little 7-line statement at the beginning, which is the preamble, which says, what is the purpose of this government, right? Not to have a Kool-Aid party and end it all, not to start World War III, not to march over a cliff. No. What are the purposes? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, bad for Don, establish justice, also bad, ensure domestic tranquility. Now, the domestic tranquility means if you collude with a foreign power that is interested in destroying domestic tranquility, right? This question about fomenting conflict, discord, intestine clashes, and so forth. That's domestic tranquility. We need it. Provide for the common defense. This is actually my text of today. My text is usually promote the general welfare, which is the one that our current age is maybe most in need of. But there's also provide for the common defense, which means that if Russia and or others, the Oriental despots of the Xi cabal, the Grand Offensive Conspiracy in Beijing, that's what it is, the Grand Offensive Conspiracy. If they are attacking elections and election bureaus and so forth, then you're not promoting the general welfare. Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Therefore, we ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So you've heard about impeachment counts that are based on emoluments, and that's indispensable. You've got other impeachment counts we'll talk about later based on obstruction of justice, but the ones I would point to, a more perfect union, this is the current regime is against that. Establish justice, they're against it. Ensure domestic tranquility, they're against that. Provide for the common defense, they refuse to. And also promote the general welfare. But we've done that enough in the past. Perfect union, justice, domestic tranquility, and basis of all this, provide for the common defense. Now, you can imagine what some of this stuff is. Trump does not provide for the common defense. He knows what it more or less would mean, and he doesn't want it. I always think about Franklin D. Roosevelt. They accuse Roosevelt, the paranoids, right, the libertarians, the reactionary Republicans, the Taft cabal. They say, well, Roosevelt wanted to go to war. He's a warmonger, meaning he wanted to oppose fascism and Nazism around the world. Yes, he did. But they say he did it in a dirty way. He went in through the back door. The back door was he really wanted to attack Germany. Couldn't get the Congress to do that, so he arranged Pearl Harbor. This is absolutely ridiculous. We've talked about this before on the show. Roosevelt is not, repeat, not the villain of Pearl Harbor. It's actually Stimson, Lovett, McCloy, plus various officers, Richmond K. Turner in the Navy Department, and so on and so forth. Churchill comes in for his share of blame, but not not FDR. That is a ridiculous thesis, right? Although all the paranoids think that they've got that, in form that they can take to the bank. Well, no, it's a very debased currency. So, can you imagine when Roosevelt, a fireside chat? Here's Roosevelt's fireside chat, translated into Trump talk. Japan, if you're listening, I dearly wish to engage in the war in Europe, but I can't move U.S. public opinion, and therefore I call on you, Emperor Hirohito, my good friend, to provide the provocation and the military action needed to get the United States into the war, and therefore I can proceed on my path of imperialism. That's about the speed. Japan, if you're listening, Hirohito, if you're listening, that's where we are. And some people still argue that that's a joke. Well, it was no joke. The laughing has ended all around the world. So that's where we stand. The impeachable offenses are myriad, but one of them has got to be that you're negating the purpose for which this government was set up, right? This Constitution and the work of Alexander Hamilton in creating the federal agencies and the government, right, where Jefferson was too tired, right? He had to take a few weeks off, and he only showed up after, a month or two there at the beginning of the federal government. So, here's where we are. We are defenseless. Trump's behavior is indefensible, and he leaves the country defenseless. So, that's where we are. Now, I'd like to go through a couple of things. One of them is a fascinating article by Professor Jed Sugarman of, I guess it's Fordham University. We'll be right with you. Back again on World Crisis Radio. 2019. And we're in what we think clearly is going to be the twilight of Trump. The twilight of Trump. This is day 800. Let's see if we can find it. We write all this stuff down. It's 827 today, Friday. So by the time you hear this, it'll be 828. If you listen on Sunday, 829. Now the standard of or the classical measure of a brief presidency is 1,000 days, right? 1,000 days was the Kennedy administration. Later, the title of a book by Arthur Schlesinger, right, was a historian, one of his advisors. So, our estimate is that at the current rate of scandals, defections from the Trump camp, attacks coming from all sorts of people, Judge Napolitano, for example, the top legal expert of the Fox News networks, because it's Fox Business as well as Fox News Channel. And notice Hannity doesn't have the legal expert. He has his own brand X legal expert. He doesn't have somebody like Napolitano. Napolitano, obviously not our favorite person, but somehow maybe tethered to reality a little bit more than some of these other characters. All right, so that's what we're dealing with today. We do want to remind you, go to AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv, because you go there, you're going to get your chance to join the podcast. Here's a podcast right now that you can hear on the weekend, usually. It's recorded, as you know, on Friday. It's posted on Saturday. I know a lot of people consult it. They listen on Sunday. So we have all that. We want you to keep doing that. But there's also the daily broadcast, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and that is at AmericanSystem.tv. AmericanSystem.tv. American System, all one word, all lowercase, nothing in the middle, no dots, no dashes, no underscores, no nothing. So let's take a look at this material. First of all, we have this interesting professor that we mentioned, that is Sugarman, Professor Sugarman of the Fordham University Law School, right? That's a big one. It's an influential one. It's not your elitist Yale or someplace like this. But it has influence because, frankly, a lot of people in the FBI come through that, right? If you're from the New York area and you want to be in the FBI, Fordham may be your ticket. It's in the Bronx, or at least the center of gravity historically has been. Now, if we can get the pop-ups enabled by Bill Gates to come on here, we want to go through this question of the proper reading of the Mueller report. And you know, our view of this is that we have not proven, nobody has proven, nobody has even attempted to prove that Trump did not collude, did not conspire. The argument from Mueller is, I can't prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, right, in this atrocious Aristotelian system of legal positivism that we have, right? Legal positivism, where morality means nothing. It's just, textualism, originalism. Those are other words for a very degraded school of legal positivism. And, of course, he's laboring under the sword of Damocles that he can't indict Trump, which, of course, would be the whole point of the exercise. Now, you can quibble, why did he take the job if he wasn't willing to carry it to the end? I think it'll turn out, whatever was going through the mind of Mueller, that the material in that report is going to be significant in, let's say, resolving the crisis of the Trump administration in the sense of getting a new cast of characters, right? That maybe William Wells' suggestion can certainly can come true in this. So let's see what we can hear from Sugarman. Now, Sugarman's notion is quite simply that Trump is indeed guilty of collusion and or conspiracy, right, as the legal terminology wants you to say it. So let's see if we can't get you some quotes on this. I'm sorry, it may have been an effect of this tornado here that the systems are going a little bit slower, right? Maybe there was some damage done. Anyway, the argument from Sugarman, this is an op-ed in the New York Times, and he says, if you forget about what Barr says and forget about anything anybody else says, just read the text, right? Focus on that. You will see that there was illegal coordination and conspiracy between Russia and the Trump campaign. There was lots of collusion and conspiracy. This was pretty much exactly what we said. Lots of collusion. Lots of collusion, lots and lots, plenty of, I guess was what we said here. And that there it is, right? You have to say that Mueller was using what amounts to an absurdly narrow kind of definition of what you have to prove, right? It's somehow, it's not equal justice under law. It's like special treatment for the president. Some people would even try to argue that you need to have that. But for whatever reason, you look at this whole thing right now, and you'd have to say that it's clear from the facts detailed in the study that Trump did do these things, and it's really only the statement from Barr that would give you any other conclusion. So illegal coordination and conspiracy between Russia and the Trump campaign. Now, I'm trying to get the tornado damaged stuff here to function here. Let's see if we can. Let's see if we're going to try to close some windows. You know how embarrassing this is. Let's see, maybe over here. But you want to take a look at it. It's in the New York Times, right? Suppose you don't have the money to subscribe or to get through the New York Times paywall. You can get a version of it on Raw Story, which is often a place where you can pick these things up, right, without going through the paywall. Takes you, and it's Sugarman, Shugerman. So he argues, despite the Barr headlines, the evidence in the writing, in the text, shows that there really was illegal conspiracy and coordination between the Trump campaign and a hostile foreign power that would be Russia. I'm paraphrasing here from Raw Story. So we'll be back in a minute here on Wiki. So we're looking at the crisis of the Trump regime and specifically the op-ed written by Professor Sugarman, Shugerman, his op-ed about the idea that Trump is actually guilty of collusion or should be charged with collusion. And his method is, first of all, to remind you, as I just have done here too on my own, that the standard of evidence is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So as a prosecutor, right, he probably had, especially with the president, I've got to make sure I can do it beyond a reasonable doubt. But Sugarman then goes on to say, even without knowing what is redacted, right, the parts that have been blacked out, the report offers substantial and credible information of the Trump campaign conspiring or coordinating with the Russian government. Under federal criminal law, conspiracy does not require direct proof or explicit words of agreement. It can be proven by actions and by circumstantial evidence from which the agreement may be inferred. If it's coherent, right, you can say there's a good chance it's there. And on campaign coordination, the Mueller report made a significant omission or an oversight, but lack of oversight, anyway, confusion, on this question when it states that coordination does not have a settled definition in federal criminal law. And he goes on, we understood coordination to require an agreement, tacit or express. But now, coordination does exist in the federal criminal law, right? Because one of the things it says is, if you're a super PAC, you're not allowed to coordinate with the campaign, right? That's an example. Here's what Sugarman writes. As the election law expert Paul Shamus Ryan noted, Congress in its 2002 campaign finance law rejected that view. You don't need to have a signed agreement. The federal regulations shall not require agreement or formal collaboration to establish coordination. In the federal regulations, coordinated means in cooperation, consultation, or concert with, or at the request or suggestion of a candidate. Notice it doesn't say the suggestion can be dismissed as a joke. Russia, if you're listening. Coordinated means in cooperation, consultation, or concert with, or at the request of suggestion of a candidate, with no need to show any kind of agreement. Expenditures for coordinated communications, see, under the election laws, again, a super PAC and a campaign, not allowed to coordinate, but if they spend money for coordinated communications, those are considered in-kind contributions, foreign contributions, public or private, and they are illegal. So he puts out it means, in effect, the working definition of collusion, coordination, conspiracy, which is used when the Federal Elections Commission is working and the federal elections laws, and these also can be enforced through the courts if it gets really bad. Sugarman argues that at least 3 events from the Mueller report could be seen as evidence of a conspiracy and coordination. 1, Manafort giving the internal polling data to Kilimnik in the top of the sixes, right? The Havana, the Grand Havana Lounge, the cigar, Thermidor, there at the top of the sixes, right? That would be 1. Roger Stone's interactions with WikiLeaks, according to this piece in Raw Story, and this could also incriminate Trump. So also Don Jr.'s communications with WikiLeaks. So according to Sugarman, quote Sugarman, this conduct by President Trump, his son, and his campaign manager and deputy campaign manager, that's Gates, are probably civil violations and coordination for enforcement by the FEC. This does not get you beyond a reasonable doubt, but it does get you to the preponderance of the evidence, right? The civil standard. This is an acceptable standard for civil violations, not punishable for prison time, right? With prison time. So where does that leave us? Well, what counts here as a high crime or misdemeanor? And this kind of coordination with Russia does qualify you. It gets you up there to argue these are high crimes and misdemeanors. There's absolutely no rationale to exclude them, right? To say that they don't count, they don't matter. So this is an important contribution, and of course it's courageous, and it shows the danger of, you watch a lot of this cable television to follow what's going on, and you see that these talking heads are people of the most arid banality in many cases. Even the ones who come on there anti-Trump. That's good that they do that. They redeem themselves somewhat. But there it is. Now, they repeat here in Raw Story the argument that I've put forward, which is that if you have the possibility of obstruction, which the report even says explicitly, then if it's successful obstruction, that may be the reason why you can't get to the conspiracy. In other words, there's obstruction. There ought to be the question, did it succeed? Did it block something that you can't see or see sufficiently? And does that then get Trump off the hook for the first part? So there you go. So New York Times, if you can. Otherwise, here on Raw Story. Now, here's another one. This is a very explicit one, and I want to go through this also. This is this character, or let's promote him, right? This is this former military man and commentator, right-wing commentator. And this is Colonel Ralph Peters. And he has often been on the aggressive or interventionist side of things. He more or less, you could have ranged him with the neocon faction. Nevertheless, he was a colonel. He was a columnist for the New York Post, as I recall. However, in the Trump era, he found that he couldn't do it. He couldn't keep going with Trump. So here he is, I believe, on CNN from, where are we? Wednesday evening. So he says, imagine, this is Ralph Peters talking now, I'll be paraphrasing, in some cases quoting. He says, suppose you're Trump and you're looking forward to 2020. You are unable to expand your voting appeal. You can't get new voters. And you have very high negatives that have only gone up. You haven't done anything to get those down. So he says, based on this, and polling in states tends to go in this way also, Trump will be out of the White House in 2021, and at that point, he will be susceptible to actions by the courts. And he says the main issue here that dictates the actual behavior of Trump is that Trump wants and needs Russian help, and he's not going to do anything to defend the United States because he would understand that as an attempt to prevent the Russians from helping him, says Colonel Ralph Peters on CNN. Second half of this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in the suburbs of the nation's capital on the banks of the Potomac. And after our brush with a tornado, or at least a tornado warning, the sun has now come out this afternoon. And, well, you can interpret that also in the scheme of the metaphors. So we were going through, I think, some very hard-hitting and germane remarks coming from not a partisan Democrat at all, but, if anything, a right-winger, a neocon, someone who has been part of the war effort in the recent years, right, the various ill-advised neocon wars of the Middle East. He had to quit his job at Fox News, I think. He was a commentator. So Colonel Ralph Peters, he says that Trump is now, this is all a paraphrase or quotes from him, that Trump is now looking towards 2020, finding that he has very high negatives. His ability to get a larger voting base, this is extremely difficult, practically impossible. The sort of gross estimate would be Trump will be out of the White House in 2021, and therefore will then be at the mercy of jail, the courts, and so forth. And therefore, says Peters, Colonel Ralph Peters, Trump wants Russian help. He wants Russian help, and he's going to do what is necessary to make sure that nothing impedes this. Peters predicts that the transition, let's say, from November 2020 to January 20th, 2021 will be the ugliest departure in U.S. history. He says this will not be a civil war, not good. The Civil War requires more dedication and more larger numbers, more equipment than the Trump forces are likely to have. But very ugly demonstrations and Trump holding on to the door jamb of the White House, right? Trying to grab hold of the banister inside the White House and screaming that he will not be taken out of the White House. So Peters says Trump fears a 2020 defeat and jail after that. This is one of the things he's most afraid of. The Deutsche Bank documents going to the New York Attorney General is an example of this. Peters goes on that Trump has no concern whatsoever for the United States, only for himself. There is no MAGA, there is no greatness for America. Rather, Trump is going to protect, as much as he can, protect the Russian attackers and slow down sanctions, slow walk any economic sanctions. There will be no public critique of Putin because Trump relies on Russian help. In terms of Trump's dealings with Kim, in response to some questions here, I think on CNN, Kim got what he wanted, right? The sanctions have been relaxed. He bought time. The whole crisis atmosphere over this has dissipated. Trump got nothing out of this. Trump got nothing from Kim. And then it's interesting that Peters says he is still haunted by that infamous moment in July of 2016, Russia, if you're listening. And his version was Roosevelt saying, Berlin, if you're listening, here's what I'd like you to do. Right? It's not a joke. It is not a joke. Nobody with any experience of the world would see this as a joke. Krugman is cited as saying that if we don't get Trump out in 2020, then democracy may be gone. The Senate Republicans, of course, sell themselves for a plate of 13 pieces of silver or whatever it is. No civil war, stresses Peters, and I think this is a voice of good sense, because the fear of civil war is why these lunatics want to always babble about civil war, right? They're so tough, posturing, and then you'll see they'll be hightailing it and skedaddling. No civil war, but isolated crackpots. Maybe we've seen a few, huh? We've seen 3 or 4 of them in recent months, and that gets very ugly. The military will not follow Trump. Important point from Peters. What he's saying is there are no pro-Trump divisions so far, and we have to keep it that way. The military, the civilian bureaucracy will not follow Trump. And as for the Republican Party, they are gone. That is a craven party. They once were patriots, all gone. They shred the Constitution. And the House of Representatives has got to impose these checks. Trump is already a rogue president, says Colonel Ralph Peters, and we have got to fight back against that. That's a very, very interesting documentation from, again, somebody with his, from me to him, no common political ground whatsoever, except there is this Constitution and the institutions that we rely on, right? And the institution's important because that's how you can correct the abuses of the current day. We have another series of these things. Let's see if we can find them. We have one a columnist at The Atlantic who essentially follows up on some of these same themes, and there's this question about, is Trump an aberration? This comes from Biden. We'll talk about Biden more in a minute. But one of the things in Biden's film, and it seems to be now part of his stump speech, is that Trump is aberrant. Now, you know the line from here, right? I hope I chanted this enough so that people remember. My line is Trump is an aberration in American history, and he is a freak of American history. Lusus naturae, freak of nature. I guess this is lusus historiae. He's a freak of American history, and that he is. That seems to be something that is getting repeated by Joe Biden. So those are all useful. How about this? A guy called Graham in the Atlantic Monthly. Trump refuses to defend the United States. Now, it's another way of saying Trump violates the preamble to the Constitution. He's negating the entire reason for having this government here. And therefore, there are these different comments, but it is converging significantly on the idea that Trump is not taking care that the laws be enforced. I think we're pretty clear about that one. But the one which is important is the refusal to defend the country against Russian attack. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Your host, Webster Tarpley, Ph.D., here in Washington, D.C., and the late afternoon of Friday, the 26th of April. And we'll have some financial comments here if we have enough time. Let me just point out, though, on this, the question of the fate of the regime. The question of power is now posed, right? Trump goes around saying, oh, there was a coup d'etat against me. It was a coup d'etat. Well, you're practically popularizing the idea, aren't you? Some interesting commentary. One commentator says, if you read I guess it's the Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, the ex-murderer Raskolnikov goes back to the scene of the crime obsessively again and again, physically. But in the case of Trump, he can't let it go. We've even got headlines now. There are people in the White House say, shut up about this already, let it go, move on. You're hurting yourself more than you know. Because it shows the guilty conscience. Consciousness of guilt? No, guilty conscience is what we know. So he wants to stonewall all of that. We want to mention in passing some interesting writing by Elizabeth Drew. Her essay is about the dangers of not impeaching. Well, we would say you don't have all the time in the world, Pelosi. The first and most important, the overwhelming point is that Trump has the nuclear launch codes. Now, we're finding out that Madman Kim, Mad Dog Kim of North Korea, who fell in love with Trump. Trump said he fell in love with Kim. This is not wise. Don't give your heart away, especially not to this creature. By the way, little Kim was feeling Napoleonic, right? Megalomania, evidence was all over the place. He had his right hand in his jacket, his overcoat, like Napoleon. And he was out at the same time. He was wearing a fedora, an old-fashioned fedora, which many compared to that hat that Oddjob had in the James Bond movies, right, where you could cut your head off by sending the hat at you like a frisbee with a saw around the outside. So that's Trump is making all kinds of mistakes, right? Not a clever demagogue, right? He could demagogue if he ought to go into a kind of a crouch and talk about his wonderful economy. But he's like Raskolnikov. He's got to go back to it again and again. Elizabeth Drew, again, is the dangers of not impeaching. He's got the codes. And what's he going to do when he finds out that his little friend Kim has been betraying him? We had the Putin-Kim summit this week. And the two of them have endorsed a position which is the opposite of Trump. They say, we've got to have a gradual process. We've got to go back to the six-party talks. It's multilateral. We know that Trump has a phobia, for whatever reason, about multilateral, right, that the U.S. gets bullied. Of course, you'd also have your own allies there, right? You'd have Japan. You'd have South Korea. That's got to be worth something, right? You want to keep them on board, too, don't you, or don't you? Maybe he doesn't. I would actually say he probably doesn't. And remember, the worst fate is to be left alone and without allies. One of the interesting things about Biden's introductory video is that he actually mentions foreign policy. I think really the only Democrats so far that I'm aware of to talk about foreign policy at all. And Biden says, you have to be loyal to your allies. Keep your promises to your allies. This is something we have not heard in a long time. So it's important to get all of those issues under discussion. So Trump is also reported to be freaking out because now we have 21 Democratic candidates, I believe. Trump is freaking out that he is being crowded off the screen. He's not getting the attention he needs for the care and feeding of his diseased ego, his hypertrophied and atrophied at the same time ego. So all of that is going on. So Trump is failing to protect the United States. Do take a look at Elizabeth Drew, right? She's written some things about this which are important. And one of her main points in her writing has been impeachment is not based on statute law. You do not have to have a formal conviction on any federal statute. Precisely because these are crimes against the Constitution. They're the kinds of crimes that really only a president or a vice president or somebody at this level could commit. So they're not in the normal state codes or federal code, right, U.S. code. No, they're very, very limited, and they've got to be tailored by the House of Representatives every time. Our general sense is that the pressure on the Pelosi leadership, which is it's a right-of-center, financier-influenced leadership. They don't like struggle. The principal reason is Pelosi's husband is a financier, and she's in touch with these areas. The reason that rich people don't like impeachment is that they don't want the situation to be radicalized. They think, if they go out and impeach a president, maybe the next step is they'll come and expropriate the property of parasites and predators like me, since financiers think that way. That's how they think. So we're hoping that evolution goes faster, right? The comments this week from Nadler, from Swalwell, and others seem to go into that direction. But the humiliation for Trump was that Mad Dog Kim gave Trump, in effect, a bill for $2 million saying your care in one of our fine hospitals for Otto Warmbier is now due. You got to pay for it. And it's not clear whether Trump paid the bill as part of his appeasement for little Kim. Trump claimed this morning on the way to the NRA that he didn't pay, but we don't know. There used to be a saying, millions for defense, not 1 red cent for tribute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is your host, Webster Tarpley, here in the Washington, D.C. National Capital Area. And nice afternoon now after the tornado warnings that were issued. Now, we've talked about Trump as an appeaser and the instability of Trump and why it is important to get this necessary action resolved soon. Let's look at the situation here with China. Right? China, a lot of these stories we've covered in significant detail in the daily programs, but the statement from Chinese representatives that China will have a permanent base on the moon near the south pole of the moon. The Chinese are going to get to that part of the moon within 10 years. Now, the United States, of course, since we have no leadership, right, since we have this raving narcissist in the White House, right? There's nothing but me, always attentive to his own grievances and nothing else. We don't have a space policy except to throw money at billionaire oligarchs who want to organize space tourism for others of their own class. The Chinese statement is that they will be putting a permanent base. We always say the permanent colonization of the moon. That, they say, is coming within 10 years. The Chinese are going to have their own space station. They're going to have other satellites. These are all based on a new version of the Long March ICBM, which is, of course, the missile that can put a Chinese hydrogen bomb on your head. Even today, I think we've had Trump raving about the wonderful quality of his relationship with the despot Xi. And he says, we have 160 million jobs. That's the most they've ever been. This must be the NRA speech. And he also says there's no question. He doesn't. The idea of military superiority or even parity never really occurs to him, at least in this phase. So Xi is a great help on the border, and then he realizes how absurd that is. He says, I mean the border between South Korea and North Korea. So they've got a space program going with real financing and planning and political commitment and what passes over there for leadership. And over here we have this clown show, everything pitched to the psychological moods of marginal individuals, right? Disgruntled misfits, I guess, are the main group that he wants to appeal to. Now, in the meantime, out in the Far East, we have the Straits of Formosa, right? The Taiwan Straits. And that is between the island of Taiwan and Fujian province of the People's Republic of China on the mainland, right? So here we had a French frigate, the Vendémiaire. And the Vendémiaire, about 3,000 tons, a little bit less, full load, was out there and simply sailed through international waters of the Taiwan Straits. And there we have a big brouhaha from Beijing, from the new despots there, saying, no, those are Chinese waters. No. Nobody in his right mind can accept this, right? They do on the ocean what Hitler did on the land, right? Hitler would grab land and countries, and the Chinese dictatorship says, no, we want this water to be under us, right? The entire South China Sea, and I think the entire East China Sea, they say, is a Chinese. It's a Beijing lake, a communist lake. Now, the other dangerous thing is we're now in a new phase of these trade talks between the Trump gang and the despots of Beijing, right? Those tyrants, the butchers of Beijing. We can say butchers of Beijing because we're coming up to the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen incidents, right? When under Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng, the prime minister, the military went on a shooting spree, killed hundreds and hundreds, tracked down other hundreds, killed some of them, and executed and then jailed also quite a lot of them. Now, my starting point, I'll repeat this again at the end. Trump, and I'm quoting here from an interesting discussion that was on C-SPAN last night, right? It was the International Trade Association with Bob Davis of the Wall Street Journal, Adam Bechsudi of the Politico, he's the Politico trade writer, James Politi of the London Financial Times, and Ann Swanson of the New York Times. And the idea now is that thanks to Trump, right? And this is an example of evil doing good, evil intent, evil actor, but nevertheless getting something done. That this has now somehow awakened the business community in the United States, or maybe it's the other way around. But anyway, we now have a situation where Trump is on the administration. This business community, in the past, they had said, no, let's appease, let's sell out, we want money, we want markets. They realized that they are the losers in the process. Finally, they figured it out. So, conflict. According to this Bob Davis, he says, look, we have the dogs are now unleashed on security, on Chinese espionage, on Chinese stealing of technology, and similar issues, right? And then, if there's a deal, Trump will crow whatever it is. He'll say it's the greatest success since, I don't know what, since, it's hard to find comparisons. But that the Chinese, of course, have successfully infiltrated large parts of the U.S. high-tech economy. The Chinese have infiltrated large parts of the U.S. high-tech economy, and this character Ren, the boss of Huawei, his daughter, Madame Meng, the dragon lady held in house arrest in Canada, Ren is on television saying, we would never spy on you, we'd never take an order like that. Call him Kylo Ren. He's the force of evil. This character Ren, and of course it's they're not good actors, right? When they're lying, you can just about see it. All right. So this is all going on. The U.S. resentment against this in the business community is very great. They all think that Trump may feel that he has to come up with a sellout appeasement trade deal. But now the business community is anti-Chinese, and that what the U.S. investors in China are going to be subjected to the death of 1,000 cuts, where they take away the big laws prohibiting you, and they hit you with a bunch of minor regulations that never end. So the death of 1,000 cuts for U.S. investors in China. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Everything went very fast as one of those tornadoes that went through the area. China, their insolence, their aggression knows no bounds. And, of course, the stupidity, cowardice, appeasement of Trump also is boundless. So what is going to happen here? Once again, Trump is going to sign something, most likely, and then say that's the greatest victory ever. But now, you can do that up to a point, right? But now with the USMCA, right, the new NAFTA, we know what it is. It's not that much different, but some aspects are worse, as far as I can see. However, the question now is that the USMCA has to pass through Congress. So when Trump goes on his anti-democratic rampages, he's offending the one person that he needs to convince, and that's Pelosi. But on something this big, there are also committee chairs, right? There are members defending their districts. It's not going to be easy for Trump to put this USMCA through, and if he can't pass USMCA, meaning Mexico, Canada, he may not be able to have the credibility with the Chinese or get that passed either. So if there's no USMCA, there may be no China Pact. Now, when? There's going to be a series of negotiations this coming week, and then after that, another negotiation week. Those are going to be in Washington and Beijing, or the other way around, but one capital and then the other. The USMCA is in trouble on the Hill. Pence has been up there to try to campaign, but it's not working. Lighthizer says if we can't get USMCA, then there will be no Trump trade agenda. Well, that's your own problem, right? Your own political stupidity. And then, of course, lined up behind them, you're going to need some kind of an arrangement with Japan and the European Union, right? That's where we should have started. USMCA, Japan, and European Union. Make the strategic policy against Russia and China mesh with the trade policy. So they're in trouble on the Hill. But now, here's the thing. Suppose you have Democrats coming in. The basic idea of these experts is that the conflicts between the U.S. and China are now so pervasive that even getting rid of Trump and dropping this trade issue, this will not bring about, what can we say, good relations. Relations are going to stay bad, and they're going to be conflicted. And I mentioned at the beginning, 30 years now since the massacre of student demonstrators and others at Tiananmen and in the city of Beijing and all over China. Remember how dramatic that was. The speculation from these experts is that the Pentagon is going to have their reasons for hostility. Other forces are going to have their reasons for hostility. But the Democrats coming in, a future Democratic president, would be able to maintain a firm and stern policy against the Beijing despots by talking about human rights. Human rights. For example, when will the U.S. media discover the Uyghurs, that she has the biggest concentration camp archipelago of anybody in the world, as far as we can see, more than Putin. You've got 1 million people in concentration camps in Xinjiang province, right, the east of China. The west, Chinese Turkestan, right? Chinese Turkestan. It's a Muslim population, the Uyghurs. When will the U.S. media discover that the Uyghurs and the 1 million people that are being held in confinement, right, inmates in these concentration camps, that's an issue you cannot ignore? And then what you can see coming out of that is a U.S. human rights policy, right, turning away from Trump and his embrace of dictatorship. You're going to necessarily have a tendency to go back towards more concern with human rights. And at that point, it becomes a means around, again, the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen to say, look, people inside China, is this Xi what you really want? Dictator for life? His stupid scribblings are in your constitution? Is that what you signed up for? And also then the U.S., right, that the U.S. public can now understand more and more what this Chinese gang is actually all about. So those are the questions. Who is making this policy? Well, there are the super hawks who don't want a deal of any kind with China. I think that must be Navarro. I'm not sure. Then you have the hawks, Michael Pillsbury, Hudson Institute. We've talked about his stuff here. And then on the softy side, the Wall Street gang, Hank Paulson, Steve Schwartzman. Their line is to Kudlow and to Mnuchin, and they want to sell out. Will Trump be able to sell out? The comment was also, the Pillsbury thesis is the real power in China is in the hands of brutal hardliners that have the real power. You don't see them. They're in the background. They're not on international trips. If you engage in diplomacy with the Chinese, you're going to get reformers who are not the hardliners, but you're also going to give yourself a very distorted idea of what the whole political debate in China is like. As for Trump on Fox News and Hannity last night, they are still going through the FISA warrants, Strzok and Page, McCabe, Comey. It never ends. Maybe we should look before we're finished. Barr. Guys in the position of Barr, the Attorney General, they have not fared too well. If we go back to Nixon, and we went through this in detail on the Thursday program, well, you had John Mitchell, who was sentenced to 1 to 4 years in jail. Actually, it was more. It was something like 2 to 8, and then it was reduced to 1 to 4. He served about 18 months because of health reasons, allegedly. And the story with Mitchell was obstruction of justice and other crimes. And he went to jail. That's the first U.S. Attorney General who went to jail because of what he did. But under Nixon, we not just had Mitchell, but we also had somebody like Richard Kleindienst. That's another Attorney General under Nixon, who was found guilty of lying to Congress on the questions pertaining to ITT and antitrust hanky-panky in favor of ITT. He got a sentence of 1 month in jail and a $1,000 fine, and then that was suspended. A lot of people thought that was one of the big mistakes that Leon Jaworski made, that if you get an attorney general, you have to be more draconian in the penalty, not less. So maybe that's what's going to be awaiting Barr. You know, these attorneys general, they're not a very distinguished group, right? If you look at somebody like Ashcroft, Ashcroft was really a key part of all the excesses of the George W. Bush administration. I was also thinking of Ed Meese under Reagan. In one of it was a court case during Meese's tenure where the assistant U.S. attorney, the prosecutor, noticed that the defendant was trying to hide behind the fact that he had been working with Ed Meese. And the federal prosecutor came out and said, Meese is a sleaze. Well, can we say that Barr is a sleaze? I think that might be possible. Anyway, that's the current situation. There will be no stability until we have change at the top. So that's it for this weekend. This has been Webster Tarpley, Ph.D., speaking from Washington, D.C., and we want you to come back on Monday to AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv, and we'll see